All right. We've been working on a walk through church history on the subject of predestination and election. We've hit the Reformation. We're now at John Calvin. All right, John Calvin. And again, the reason we're doing this is because we're getting into uh, the end of chapter 8 in Romans and the beginning of chapter 9, or really all of chapter 9 and chapter 10. And these are the passages that have created um, the different denominations, arguments. There's people that don't believe these passages. Um, they don't trust in God's sovereignty and salvation. And you got the issue of free will or not having free will. All that is born out of these passages. This is the most exhaustive passage on the subject. It's the most clear and the most concise. And it pretty much settles the argument on whether or not God is sovereign in election and predestination. So, and again, the accusation by the other side is that these are new doctrines, and they are not new doctrines. They've been around for a very, very long time, and God used these doctrines to reform His church, right? And that's what we want to understand. That's what I want you to understand from this little digression in our study, is that this is the doctrines that God used to reform His church. So last week we looked at Calvin's early life through his appointment to the pastorate at Geneva. Then again he gets banished, and then after that he returns to Geneva after his banishment. Persecution of the reformers increased in France, forcing refugees to move to Geneva. Um, at this particular time, Strasbourg is the kind of the headquarters of the Reformation, but that's eventually going to move to Geneva. Martin Bucer is the leader of that movement there in Strasbourg, and that's where Calvin would like to stay. However, he has to abandon his pursuit of being, scholar and learning and all that kind of stuff to be a pastor. So, and again, I want to note that all the pre-reformers, which are known as morning stars of the Reformation, and all of the reformers of the church are Augustinian at this point, right? Now, that doesn't mean that everybody everywhere is staunchly Augustinian. There are individuals who believe in free will and all of those things, but by and large, the majority of the reformers and the church is all of. Let me say it like this: all of the reformers and all of the morning stars are Augustinian. Anybody that has any impact at all is Augustinian. And that is as it pertains to the depravity of man and God's sovereignty in salvation, right? Y'all understand that, correct? All right, so we learned of Gottschalk of Orbiz, 800 time frames, Wycliffe, John Huss. Wycliffe's followers were the Lollards. You get the Martin Luther, Ulrich Zwingli, and now Calvin. We skipped over a lot of guys. You have Martin Bucer, Peter Martyr, Philip Melanchthon, many others. William Farel, for example, who was an associate of Calvin. He is one of the major reformers as well. So there's just reformers everywhere. You got Waldensians that were pre-reformers that hid out in France until the Reformation happens. And then they finally get to come out of hiding and all that good stuff. You just have all of those guys. You have movements throughout church history, and it always coincided with some monk or some scholar, pastor, priest, or whatnot, what have you, studies the actual scriptures, and that's what leads to the Reformation or a reform in that particular area. Okay. Today we're going to continue with Calvin and Geneva. So he's returned to Geneva. Uh, he was banished in his first term in Geneva, only to be invited back again in 1540. So a political revolution takes place, and a power that is a party that is friendly to Calvin gets put in power. So uh, Calvin, for the Genevan Church, he wins a large measure of independence from the state control. At this time, the Genevan Church was controlled by the state. Again, we have to understand some of these things if you want to understand church history. We don't have to understand it, but I like to understand everything. There are differences um, throughout Europe, and one of the chief criticisms of the Reformation by the Catholics was that you allowed the state to have too much control over you, and that is true to a certain extent. But and that happened in the Reformed movements. That happened with Luther. The state was the one that controls the functioning of the church. So you have this stuff that's going on. Geneva is in large part under control of the state or the city council. Um, can you imagine your commissioners being in charge of the functioning of the church? Right. That's ultimately what was going on. He did have to compromise. Calvin did by agreeing that the elders would be chosen by the city magistrates from among their own number. Uh, Again, this is not a real big deal if everybody's Christian, but not everybody's Christian, right? And certainly we know that politicians are not always Christian, right? So there's some problems with this, but he does have to uh, uh, agree to that. And again, it would morph into kind of a mix of city magistrates being elders in the church, and then some that were not, that were Calvin trained, theologically sound, biblically sound elders. All right. 1555, he secures the power of the church discipline and excommunication for the consistory, that is the pastors and the elders, and not the city council. So Calvin then has a little more control on who he excommunicates, right? That's a big, you know what excommunication is, right? You're done, right? You're not a part of the church, usually over heresy or moral, unrepentant moral failure, things of that nature. Uh, so I mean, and it's prescribed in the scriptures. It's very important to have church discipline within a church. And it's very important for the church to have control over that, not the city, not the state. But Calvin, he doesn't necessarily want to reform just the religious life in the Genevan church. He wants to reform the entire city. He wants the entire city to be brought into conformity with the will for human living, with God's will for human living. That's what he wants. That's what he envisions. His great vision was not only to build up a true Christian church in Geneva, but also to make Geneva itself a true Christian city. Calvin therefore strove to purify the moral life in Geneva society, persuading the city council to enforce severe laws against adultery, prostitution, pornography, drunkenness, dancing, gambling, swearing, disobedience of children to parents, and so on. So he wants the city itself to be Christian and to be a moral city. He, in large part, he succeeds. Calvin's Geneva eventually becomes near perfect pattern of a reformed community. Reformed refugees from all over Western Europe, especially in France, flocked to the city of Calvin. Geneva, rather than Strasbourg, now became the great international headquarters of the Reformed Protestantism. All right, so the Reformed refugees helped Calvin to make Geneva into a model Reformed city, and at the same time, Genevan example inspired them to take the Reformed faith back to their own homelands. John Knox, for example, pastored a congregation of English Protestant refugees in Geneva from 1556 to 1559. He says this about Geneva. He says, I could have wished, yea, and cannot cease to wish, that it might please God to guide and conduct yourself to this place, where I neither fear nor am ashamed to say is the most perfect school of Christ that ever was on the earth since the days of the apostles. In other places, I confess Christ to be truly preached, but manners and religion to be so sincerely reformed, I have not yet seen any other place beside. And again, he's speaking of Geneva. So what Calvin creates there in Geneva is as close as you can get to a utopian Christian society. There was a German Lutheran pastor by the name of Valentin Andrea. He says, when I was in Geneva, I saw something great which I remember and desire as long as I live. There is in Geneva the perfect system of a perfect government, but the city's special beauty is a moral discipline which makes weekly investigations into the behavior of the citizens, including their smallest transgressions. The discipline is carried out first by district inspectors, then by the elders, and finally by the magistrates, according to the nature of the sin and the moral condition of the offender. All cursing, swearing, gambling, luxury, strife, hatred, and deceit are forbidden, while greater sins are hardly even heard of. What a glorious beauty of the Christian faith shines forth in such purity of moral conduct. We must lament with tears that it is lacking and almost totally neglected among us Lutherans. Indeed, if it were not for the religious difference between me and the Genevans, I would never have been bound to that city by our agreement in morality. And I would forever have been bound to that city by our agreement in morality, and I have ever since tried to introduce something like it into our churches. Just as outstanding as the public discipline was, the home discipline of my Genevan landlord, Scarron, that was the dude's name. His house was distinguished by daily worship, reading of the scriptures, the fear of God in word and deed, and a holy moderation in eating, drinking, and manner of dress. So this is what Geneva looked like. Uh, agree with it or not agree with it, to us Americans, it seems like we give the state authorities a little bit too much authority, but that was Geneva. Geneva was the place of Christianity. It was the hub of the Reformation. All right. Uh, Calvin ruled Geneva through the persuasive power of the spoken word. He preached not only on Sundays, but on 3 weekdays too. Lectured twice, or theology twice a week, and attended a weekly meeting of the consistory every Thursday. He expounded the Bible every Friday at a special spiritual conference called the Assembly. Calvin had no political power, and the council did not even grant him citizenship in Geneva until 1559. He reformed the city by preaching and not by force or decree. So again, uh, he is the spokesman of Geneva. He becomes the spokesman of Geneva, but it doesn't start out like that, right? It's not right off the bat. So, in other words, what happens in Geneva is um, is through his preaching, through his teaching, and through the influx of these immigrants that move to Geneva. Geneva, they vote in uh, leaders who are going to enforce biblical morality, right? And that's what happens. This is the consensus of the people at Geneva, the majority. Again, they're democratic in their electoral processes and all that. So this is the society that the people wanted. This is what they finally agreed to. But it takes a while. Okay, he does have opposition. 1548 to 1555. He has a bitter conflict, probably his most bitter conflict, between the Calvin supporters and his opponents. His opponents dominated the city council during this period, and they were mostly native of Geneva. They were the original people that lived there, long established families who resented the influx of 6,000 foreign religious refugees into the small city. It had a native population of only about 13,000. So, uh, had their population increased significantly over this time frame. All right, so you've got all this persecution that's taking place in all these other cities and all these other kingdoms. France, for example, has up there. If y'all remember from last week, after his first banishment, he goes to Strasbourg. Pharaoh goes to some other place, and then the French king begins persecuting uh, French reformers and the Protestants, and they kick them all out, and they flee to Geneva. So this influx happens, um, and then of course Geneva is sitting here with 13,000 folks, and they don't like this influx. His detractors, his opponents, are libertines. Calvin calls them libertines. We call them antinomians. That's no law. You'll remember, Pastor Allen has talked several times, as I've mentioned it before. You have the Gnostics in the early Christian history. They have two groups, the ascetics and the antinomians. It means no law. They believe that you can just do whatever you want, right? That you can just live any way you want. There's no morality, and in large part, these guys are pantheism. They believe in pantheism. They believe they deny the inspiration of Scripture. They maintain that God and the universe are identical. So that's what you got going on here in Geneva. They're not all perfect. Christianity doesn't dominate everything like we would think, right? Pantheism is is alive and well here in Geneva. So, and again, Switzerland has always had this ability to be a little bit more independent because their geography it's easily defended because of the mountains, and the climate is not very hospitable to armies. So Switzerland's always been a place where you can hide out a little bit, right? So you've got pockets of free thinking people in this particular place in Geneva. They happen to have a lot of pantheism going on among the libertines. Calvin hated it. He hated this place. He was depressed a lot of times especially during this period where these libertines just kept attacking him, threatening his life, and giving him problems. At one point, he said, "I wish that God would let me leave this place." He wrote that into a letter to a friend. In 1549, a guy named Perrin was elected chief magistrate of Geneva. He is his biggest enemy. He hates Calvin, and by 1555, Calvin and his supporters had completely triumphed over the Libertine Party. So just that 5 or 6 year period there, Calvin goes from being hated by most of those that are on the city council to becoming to overthrowing Perrin. Matter of fact, Perrin and his followers started some type of little riot after they lost the election, and then they were imprisoned. Most of them were executed. Perrin ended up dying in prison for his attempted overthrow and riot and all that kind of stuff. So there's no love lost between them. There was there was a little more rugged people back then. They didn't have the same type of mercy that we have today on dissenters. But there you go. That was the Libertine Party. So with the persecution of the French Reformation and persecution in other places, you have refugees that flee into Geneva. These influx of Christian immigrants turned the tide politically for Calvin in Geneva. All right, so there you go. Calvin now is in control in the last years of his ministry in Geneva, and this is when things really begin to take off. And again, our verse 8:28, and we know all things work together for good to those who love God, right? To those who are called according to His purpose. This is what it looks like, right? This is what that verse looks like in real life. God is providing for those who love Him, for those who are called according to His purpose, for His glory, right? This is what that looks like. God is in control. Although we may be persecuted here and we flee somewhere else, God is using that for His glory and for our good. And It happened to be Geneva. His second opponent is a guy named Michael Servetus. This guy is who the Arminians always try to blame Calvin for being a bad guy. They always call Calvin a murderer. Calvin was this, Calvin was that. Calvin murdered Servetus. And if they're really good and they really know what they're talking about, they'll say Calvin chopped off Servetus's head, which is not the case at all, right? Michael Servetus was a physician. He actually discovered the circulatory system in the body. So he was a brilliant guy. He was gifted with a brilliant mind as a physician, but he was a blasphemer and a Trinity denier. And he wrote a lot, and he openly mocked the Trinitarian Godhead. He openly mocked what we would call orthodoxy. He was brash, just obnoxious at times. He shocked Roman Catholics and Protestants alike by his writings, where he denied and mocked the doctrine of the Trinity, which he called a three-headed monster. That term has been brought to life. You have a place over there in Brentwood. Who was the weight loss guru lady? Yeah, she crashed a plane in Percy Priest, right? That she died. Well, she used that term, three-headed monster. She's got Remnant Fellowship, right? All that mess up there, that heresy. All of that, same as Servetus. Servetus, though, was very, very brash, very, very mocking, condescending, all of those types of things. Kind of one of those guys. Knew he was a smart guy, and that's just who he was. He was a part of the rationalist branch of the Radical Reformation. So remember what's going on with the Reformation here. You've got Lutheranism, you've got the Reformed movement. A lot of times those get kind of put together. They're not put together. They believed a lot of the same things, primarily election and predestination, which is what we're studying, but they weren't the same. They couldn't make amends. Luther and Zwingli, for example, couldn't come together. Calvin couldn't come together either. And Melanchthon, Luther's successor, loved Calvin, believed like Calvin, but they still couldn't reconcile the two groups. So Lutheranism, Reform movement, and then you have the Radical Reformation. And inside of the Radical Reformation, you've got three groups actually, which are the Anabaptists, the Rationalists, which was what Servetus was. Rationalists denied the Trinity, basically. And then there was another group. I forget who they were. It'll come to me after class, right? But that's who these guys were. And the Radical Reformation, the Munster, y'all have heard of Munster? Have y'all ever heard of Munster?
Cheese?
No. The Munster Rebellion. The Munster Rebellion was a group of Anabaptists who was heretical. They took over Munster. They took over the political stuff, and then almost immediately the Catholics kind of besieged the city. But the leaders of the movement there at Munster, instituted communism and polygamy, and just it was part of the Radical Reformation. That was part of those groups. They were part of the Anabaptists. Now there were some Anabaptists that weren't as bad and more theologically correct. Some were very educated, but they just kind of got lumped into the Radical Reformation. But so you get the Reformed movement, which Calvin, Zwingli, Knox, all those guys. Lutheranism, Luther, Philip Melanchthon, some of the stuff that swept into the Dutch nations, and then you have the Radical Reformation that pretty much died off fairly quickly. But that's the three groups. Calvin replies to Servetus's letters. He tries to reason with him from the scriptures. This guy doesn't have it. Michael Servetus is not going to listen to any type of reason or any type of scripture. He's got his belief, and that's what he's going to do. And he's going to continually mock and write and blaspheme God. Calvin washes his hands of Servetus and describes him as a desperately obstinate heretic. Uh, Calvin was not very tolerant of heresy. Nobody was, right? Again, Catholic or Protestant alike. If you are a heretic, if you blaspheme, well, let's just say it like this. What is the greatest commandment? We know what the greatest commandment is, right? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, right? Second is like it, and love your neighbor as yourself. All right, so if there's the greatest commandment, what's the greatest sin? Not loving God, blasphemy, right? And if the state and the church is one and the same, I mean, most of us believe in the death penalty, correct? Most of us do not like the fact that in our society today, we do not execute murderers, right? Or child molesters. Most of us have that feeling. You know, we go to Genesis and we say that, if man sheds another man's blood, by man's hand shall his blood be shed, right? By government, right? Almost all of us have that feeling. There's some of us that are more pacifists and don't, but for the majority, most of us don't like the fact that our left-leaning society today has done away with capital punishment. Well, but we believe that capital punishment is reserved for the most heinous crimes, murder, right? Well, these guys definitely embraced capital punishment, but the greatest sin is not murder. The greatest sin is blasphemy, right? And so blasphemy deserves death. That's their reasoning. You can question it. You can disagree with it all you want. You can plead for religious freedom and all that. And I agree, we should have religious freedom. I like the idea of a separation of church and state. I can be a Baptist without worrying about my Presbyterian friends coming to cut my head off, right? Because I believe that you should be baptized after confession. I don't think the state uh, should be head over the church. There's problems with that. And then there's problems with the free church as well. You've got everybody goes off and does everything. Um, but nonetheless, he is convicted. He's arrested. He's condemned to death for heresy by the Roman Catholic Inquisition in Vienna, which is southern France. Servetus escaped from prison, and for no good reason, he wants to go to Geneva in August of 1553. In Geneva, somebody recognizes him, and the Genevan authorities arrest the notorious anti-Trinitarian. So it's almost like this guy was trying to pick a fight with Calvin. He really wanted to make himself known. He wanted to debate Calvin in a debate format. He recognized Calvin as probably one of the most educated, the most accomplished scholars, and he wanted to debate him. And he didn't get what he wanted. He had he's arrested, and he has all the church fathers to debate, and he's obviously not going to listen to any of them. And rather than let him have a pedestal, they try him, condemn him, and then put him to death for heresy. Uh, Needham says this. He says, like almost all Christians in his day, Calvin accepted that the state was under moral obligation to God to punish heretics. Ironically, even Servetus himself taught that Christian magistrates should put heretics to death. The crucial difference between Servetus and his Roman Catholic and Protestant opponents was that they believed there was no greater heresy than denying the Trinity. If the Genevan City Council convicted Servetus, then he would face the death penalty for his anti-Trinitarian faith. All right, so here's the problem. You've got the libertines who are in control at this time. They delayed Servetus's conviction and part of his trial, and they didn't do this because they cared for Servetus or they had any type of love for Michael Servetus, but because they disliked Calvin. The problem was that all of Western Christendom wanted Servetus to be executed, So they had to. They had to go ahead with this. They had to go ahead and do this. They had to let the trial begin and the conviction happen. Again, this is something both the Catholics and the Protestants could agree on. So the Libertines had to let the trial and the conviction take place. Uh, Servetus is convicted of heresy. Calvin is the lawyer that brings the charges of heresy. He articulates his points of heresy. Uh, he is convicted. He evidently Calvin does a good job, and the sentence of execution and the guilty verdict is brought forth, and it's to be carried out by burning. They're going to burn Servetus. All right, this is what the libertines who are in control. This is uh, their deal. And again, they are going to burn Servetus. That is the sentence. Calvin was glad that Servetus had been sentenced to death, but he was horrified at the cruel method of execution. He tried to get it changed. This is where the Arminians try to say that Calvin chopped off Servetus's head. He tries to get it changed to something swift and merciful. In other words, Calvin advocates for beheading him. Make it fast, right? The city says, nope, we're not going to do that. We're going to burn him at the stake. Actually, his old friend William Farel called him soft. And again, the council refused to listen to Calvin, and Servetus was burned at the stake on 17 October 1553. All right? Burned at the stake. This has always been a mark, historically, in modern day, on Calvin because he advocated for it. But everyone did. Right? Again, that doesn't make it correct. That doesn't make it right. But if the Arminians were in control, they would have done the same thing. All right? This is just the nature of the society and the culture that was around. You just don't blaspheme God, right? You don't go to a Muslim country that's in Iran, for example, and call Muhammad a demon. They're going to kill you. All right? That is part of it, right? Now you can go do that and die a martyr for Christianity, but that's what is to be expected, right? That's what happened in Western Europe in the 1600s or the 16th century, right? Does that make sense? All right. Calvin's achievements. And again, well, let's read his achievements and then we'll talk about that. Nick Needham provides us with a list of Calvin's achievements. He provided the Reformed churches with a clear, deep, solid theology in the Institutes. Remember, he writes the Institutes of the Christian Religion. It's an instant success. It shapes, it gives the church a massive knowledge of the early church fathers. This is what the Institutes display, and it's supported by outstanding work of Bible exposition in his commentaries. Again, Calvin had commentaries. He had sermons. He had a secretary that would copy his sermons. He just vast amounts of information that he published. One of the greatest expositors in Christian history. You can still get Calvin's commentaries today, right? And they're still awesome, right? I mean, it's just amazing that people just don't read them. But even in some seminaries, they're even still part of the curriculum. He gave the Reformed movement a pattern of church government which mobilized the laity and enabled Reformed believers to survive, organize, and flourish despite state opposition and persecution. He showed the world a city, which was Geneva, which embodied the Reformed faith and lived it out. The infectious power of Geneva's example inspired others to reform their communities as Calvin had reformed his. He fashioned the Reformed faith into an international movement with a sense of brotherhood which crossed national boundaries. From Geneva, Calvin kept up a vast correspondence with Reformed leaders throughout Europe, advising, encouraging, exhorting, rebuking. Geneva became the vital center of a mighty international Reformed cause. He made the Reformed faith into the great Protestant missionary movement of the 16th century. Geneva was an international training center for Reformed pastors, preachers, theologians, and missionaries. That's something that you might want to just underline right there. What Calvin creates in Geneva is an international training center for Reformed pastors, preachers, theologians, and missionaries. The reason the English-speaking world believes the Bible is because of Calvin and Geneva, right? Now, again, ultimate glory goes to God, right? But it is Geneva that provides the hub for the preachers to flee to be trained, to recover, to save some money, and then take the gospel back to their homelands. That's what Geneva is. The Genevan Academy, founded by Calvin in 1559 and headed by the Psalm translator Theodore Beza, who was ultimately Calvin's successor. He was also a distinguished theologian, attracted students from all over Europe. The academy began with 162 students. Within 6 years, the number had skyrocketed to more than 1,600. Although it also offered training in law and medicine, the academy's chief purpose was to prepare men for the ministry. It sent out an ever-growing army of Reformed believers to spread the faith in other countries, particularly France, Calvin's native homeland, which always had a special place in his heart. So, Geneva is the hub of the Reformation. All right, Calvin's Geneva. So when these guys are critical of Calvinism or Augustinianism, they're critical of the Reformation, right? We embrace the Reformation. We embrace the Reformed faith. If it's not for these guys, you don't even have Arminianism, right? Jacob Arminius doesn't even come on the scene. He doesn't have a platform to preach what he preaches. So all these free-wheeler guys that have all this hatred for Calvin and hatred for Augustine and hatred for anybody else, they also have a hatred for Martin Luther. They also have a hatred for Ulrich Zwingli, John Knox, William Tyndale, who they get their English Bible from. You see what I'm saying? Do you see the intention here now? How important it is to understand the truth of the Reformation? This is the Reformation. This is the reason we exist. So, again, Geneva and Calvin is the hub of the Reformation. People from all over the place. We're going to look at the English Reformation next week. And in that, you have William Tyndale, you have Hugh Latimer, Mr. Ridley, you have Bloody Mary. Y'all ever heard of Bloody Mary? Where do you think those preachers went during the reign of Bloody Mary? To go and hide. Where do you think Tyndale went when he was persecuted? He goes to Geneva, right? It's Geneva where he begins translating his Bible into English, right? That's where they go. That's where they get trained. John Knox is in Geneva. He pastors a church there for 5 years before he goes back to Scotland and becomes the trumpet blast of Scotland. All throughout our history, the Reformation, it's Geneva, right? This is so vitally important for us to understand. Wouldn't you agree? All right, so between Lutheranism and the Reformed faith, the gospel of salvation by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, according to the scriptures alone, for the glory of God alone, spreads across Europe. It just makes sweeping progress through Europe. What was once known as Augustinianism is now known as Calvinism. As Calvin and Luther's popularity grew throughout the Netherlands, they would give us the great Heidelberg Catechism. Many things, right? The Canons of Dort, the Westminster Confession, the First and Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. all these great confessional statements, and I would even submit to you the Abstract of Principles and the Southern Baptist Faith and Message, has their origin in Geneva, in the Institutes of the Christian Religion, right? There's some things that we disagree with on, right? But by and large, this is the place where it begins. It's from Geneva that the Dutch Reformed Church is born. From Geneva, the gospel would pepper communities throughout Europe. Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland would fall to the sovereign Jesus and his gospel. All those nations. Bohemia, actually, they didn't really much care for Germany, so they said, we don't need Luther, we have Huss. So, again, that's where Huss came from. But again, Bohemia, Hungary, and Poland, all of them begin their Reformation. Royalty, nobility, and peasant from Denmark to Scotland would embrace the Reformation. From France to England, Geneva would send preachers to France, Spain, England, all over the world, especially in Europe. Right? This is the Reformation. How far Western civilization's fallen, right? This is why you can't study Western civilization without also studying church history. All of this wars and things that take place, all this stuff, it's all intertwined with church history, isn't it? Right? You can't understand the split from the east to the west without understanding the great schism, the iconoclasm, all the things that take place. You can't, it's just throughout church history. At some point, though, we are going to have to not only look at the English Reformation, but we'll look at Arminius comes on the scene. And, of course, Wesley and Wesleyan theology, he's very Arminian. Him and Whitefield. Whitefield is Calvinist. They're friends. But we'll see that with the Church of England and all that good stuff, right? And then after all that, we'll probably look at the founding of the Southern Baptist Convention, Baptists in America, and then we'll get back to our study of Romans 8 and 9, right? Any questions? Does Renee know what? Yeah, humanism is? Okay, so humanism. She asked the question last week, what was humanism? And I didn't do a very good job of explaining it, right? So humanism, we got just a little bit of time. I know you ladies need to go to the bathroom. But so, again, via moderna, scholasticism was the reigning academic philosophy, right? A lot of it come from Aquinas. It was more of a moral, rigid, and that's it type of attitude. Humanism, again, it is linked. If we're talking about especially Erasmian humanism, humanism is the study, no matter if it's pagan or Greek, whatever, Roman, Egyptian, even just the study of human achievement and what works, right? What makes life better, right? Humanism. Now, the difference between humanism of that day and secular humanism of today, it puts God, makes man God, right? So it's just whatever feels good, do it kind of thing. Just kind of silliness. But there is some good in studying the old stuff. For example, rhetoric, all of the disciplines, rhetoric, history, government even. We see that so where part of this, again, rhetoric is super important. What makes George Whitefield such a great preacher is partly because he's trained in theater, which, again, accompanies a lot of rhetoric, study of rhetoric, just persuading people with words, all of that, all right? And just government, too. But where Paul did not come preaching with words, with educated kind of deal, but he came with power. Well, Apollos was different, wasn't he? If you remember from First Corinthians, Apollos had a great following. Apollos was probably trained in rhetoric. Augustine, for example, was also trained in academic rhetoric and all of that kind of stuff. He was very persuasive. He had the ability to woo the masses with his oratory, right? We see that even in politics in America, those guys that have the ability to deliver a speech are usually pretty powerful, right? Reagan, for example, had that voice that was carried and was able to deliver a speech and persuade you with his words, regardless if you liked his politics or not. Obama was similar. He was able to deliver a speech halfway decent. Even the great preachers of today, right, that we look to, that we like a lot, no matter if they're moral failure or not, we usually follow them because they're able to persuade you with words, right? That's where the study of rhetoric comes in. Things of that nature. Government, for example, a good example of humanism, where our founding fathers of America studied a lot of government. They were humanists as well in the fact that they studied Greek democracy. They picked from that and the Roman Republic. They didn't want an empire. Rome started out as a republic, and then it fell to the empire. Well, they put in place in America certain checks and balances that could keep that from happening. Right? We don't have a Caesar anymore. I know some accuse Trump of being a Caesar, but we're supposed to operate within checks and balances. The judicial branch, the legislative, and then the executive branch. So that's why all three of those. That comes from studying humanism, studying the past, right? And even though the Romans were pagan, even though the Greeks were pagan, they still had some good things that we could learn, right? That's basically what humanism is. Does that make sense? All right.